Okay then, everyone. Welcome to the CR&DALL Seminar series event. Before we start, some housekeeping. You can use the chat to introduce yourself and pose questions, and there'll also be plenty of opportunities for discussion. But please keep microphones muted at other times and be aware that the seminar is being recorded. So, CONFINTEA VII, staying alive, alert, awake and enthusiastic as civil society. And our presenter is Professor Jose Roberto, better known as Robbie Guevara. CONFINTEA VII, the 7th International Conference in Adult Education, was hosted in June 2022 in Marrakesh, Morocco. CONFINTEA is a significant international adult learning and education conference because aside from it only happening every 12 years, it was an opportunity to review the commitments made in CONFINTEA VI in Belém in 2007. The first CONFINTEA since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, with the commitment to lifelong learning opportunities for all. Plus, it comes at a time when ALE is becoming an essential tool for pandemic recovery and for addressing global issues like the climate crisis and the ongoing conflict situations around the world. Now, Robbie is an educator with extensive experience in adult, community and popular education, with a focus in education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. He is a sought-after facilitator for his expertise in participatory, creative and experiential learning methodologies, developed from his years of working as a grassroots environmental educator and theatre practitioner in the Philippines. There is some more about Robbie on the flyer, so I don't want to say any more and let us just go straight to Robbie. Thank you, Robbie, and if you want to take over. Thank you.
Thank you. I won't take over. I'm just gonna share my screen, but I just want to say good morning to the colleagues. I don't know where Stephen and Joe are, so maybe Stephen and Joe, if you could just tell us, is it good morning, good afternoon, good evening, where you are?
In Zimbabwe, it's now afternoon. It's almost 20 minutes to 1. So it's good afternoon, and thank you very much, Prof. and President. My name is Dr. Stephen Mahere. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe, and we had the pleasure of, as University of Zimbabwe Faculty of Education, we had the pleasure of hosting Robbie Mark, and with a very productive quality time with him. We benefited quite a lot. We hope in the future he's going to remember and join us. And we are also privileged to have the head of the Department of Community and Social Development, which includes adult education and lifelong learning, Dr. Priscilla Mujuru, who is also with us. So we'll be participating together in the seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Good afternoon, also Priscilla. And is Joe?
Yeah. Good afternoon. How are you?
Oh, are you there, Joe? On the, are you online? Or there's another?
Yeah. She can speak now. Yes, you can hear her now. Yes.
I can hear her. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
And where is Joe?
Joe?
No, we are just the two of us. Just the two of us.
There's another person. Yes, so Stephen and Priscilla, right?
Then Priscilla. Yes.
Yes. So Joe just in the chat. Okay. Okay. So she cannot speak because she's at work. Okay. Thank you, Joe. Yes. So maybe it's a small enough group. Mike, is it possible for us just to go around the room so we can also hear the colleagues who's in the room? Thanks.
A second-year PhD student and also EGTA on the Education for Sustainable Futures program. And I'm here to just participate in this seminar series.
You're muted, Robbie. You're still muted.
Sorry. Yes. So if you could raise your hand, because it's small, I can't see who's talking. Okay, that's
Okay, I will just go again if that's fine.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm Abimbola Bodring. I'm a second year PhD student in education and also a GTA on the Education for Sustainable Futures program. I'm just here to participate in the CR&DALL Seminar series.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Mike Osborne, Director of Cradle.
I'm Mike.
Okay, I'm Nasreen Abdullah. I'm PhD student from Kurdistan. So I'm here for Erasmus PhD exchange program. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Evgenia Dragomirova. I'm researcher from Ukraine. So I'm glad to be here and join to this very nice seminar. Thank you. Hi, can you see? Yeah, I'm a PhD student. I'm not in any year because I just passed my Viva.
Oh, well done.
I'm a Chinese student here for 7 years. So here is the first time I came to this new building to participate in this seminar. It's a kind of new for me. It's a hybrid. So I'm so excited to see people like face to face for so long.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Azad from Kurdistan. I'm PhD student for the last year at the College of Science, Department of the Mathematics. My title is Maximizing the Efficiency of the Generalized Linear Model by using a power transformation. I came here to do or to collaborate or to conduct a part of my PhD research at the Glasgow University. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rob Mark, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at Glasgow University and tutor. And I'm very pleased to be here in this new research centre. It's really an amazing place, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity to connect and work with people, not only in Glasgow, but all over the globe, really. So I'm really pleased to see some of my colleagues from Zimbabwe, who I was with a few weeks ago. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing some of you here in Glasgow next June.
Okay, so you were the one who visited them. So nice to see you, Rob. Okay, who else?
Yeah.
I am Loureen. I am a PhD student from Kurdistan, Iraq, and I'm linguistics major, and I'm very happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcela Ramos. I am a research fellow at the Sustainability IT in the College of Social Sciences. I'm here to attend this seminar and join with you.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Faris Kete. I'm a lecturer at University of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and also a part-time PhD student. And now I'm at the University of Glasgow within the Erasmus Plus postgraduate research program for 3 months.
Thank you.
And I think the only person left is me. I'm Dr. Muir Houston from the School of Education, and I'm Deputy Director of CR&DALL as well. So I think that's everyone.
I think that's it. We haven't heard, we said hello to Priscilla. Priscilla, can we hear from you now? Hi, Priscilla.
Everyone, my name is Priscilla Mujuru. I am coordinating the lifelong learning program within the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Yeah, I think that's what I can say. And we had a good time with Dr. Mark Rob. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks, Mike, for organizing this. This has been a long time coming from the time, I think, and again, months ago when you were also. Now, where were you, Mike? When I spoke to you at the SM Lifelong Learning Hub. And so, yeah, thanks for the invitation. And what I'd like to do, again, it's going to be very informal, given that we're a small group. And Mike said we've got an hour and a half. Is that correct? Okay, so it would be, so it's now 9:46 here in the evening, but I'm so used to having to work across time zones given the last 3 years, but also it's really a pleasure to speak to people from different parts of the world. And hopefully we'll have time to, I'll try to speak for half an hour and we'll have time to have some interaction. So I'll share my screen and I want to make sure that I'm doing it correctly. Can you confirm, Muir, that you can all see the screen?
Yes, you can see that fine, Robbie.
Okay. If I start to talk very fast, when I get excited, I start to talk very fast. And so somebody can just speak up and say you're talking too fast. Okay. And so, yeah, so I think, so I've titled it CONFINTEA VII, which is CONFINTEA is the acronym in French of the International Adult Education Conference. It's the 7th conference, and I've entitled it Staying Alive, Alert, Awake, and Enthusiastic as Civil Society. Okay, I'll get to explain this later, but I'd like to just put myself in context of where I am. I am currently living in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, Australia. And this is where my university is. RMIT is the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology that has become a university in the 90s. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the lands, the unceded lands in which my university stands, which is basically in the city of Melbourne. As a migrant from the Philippines, and you can speak by my name and but also maybe my accent, I've been particularly humbled by the words published in The Age, which is our paper here in October 2021 by Professor Eleanor Burke, the chairperson of the Europe Justice Commission here in the state of Victoria. And for those who are familiar in terms of how disenfranchised and marginalized our Aboriginal communities are in Australia, particularly even in education, the level of education, the achievements that they have is very low compared to the normal population, normal meaning to say people who might live within the cities. And so because of this, we have in Victoria established what they call a Justice Commission. And she said, regardless of circumstance, people who come here from other lands have another country where their languages, history, and social systems reside and thrive. And I want to put that center because as a migrant, having been successful and having been working at the university now for 20 years, having studied here as a migrant student, like some of you, I did my PhD here, but also I did my master's here, but all of my other education was in the Philippines. I realized that like I'm going home to the Philippines this time next week. I can speak my language, we have our own culture, but in situations for Aboriginal communities, it's not as free. It's not as, because of the long history of colonization. And so if you start to hear about the debates around the voice to parliament, and this is where the truth-telling process about the First Peoples of Australia and the current push, we will have a national referendum in terms of a voice to parliament that would actually happen next year. There's this big debate, how do we recognize the First Peoples of this country? And for me, as an educator, as an adult educator, as somebody who has worked on education and sustainability, this is not just a cultural issue. This is really an issue that goes to the heart of the kind of future, the kind of relationships that we want. So I want to put that front and center because even when we start to talk about adult learning and education, I think central to the work of adult learning and education from the experience that I've had is about healing, it's about reconnecting, but also it's about developing a future of that is about equality for all. The title comes from actually an action song. And I just wanted to make sure, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the song, but I'm just going to play the first part. If you want to become alive, alert, and enthusiastic, you can go along and sing and do the action. It's very simple, but it's what we call an action song. So here we go.
I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, awake, alert, alive. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic.
Okay, go.
I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, awake, alert, alive. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic.
Now, why do I start with that song? I start with that song really because I was at the end of CONFINTEA VII, I was actually reminded of what we were doing in CONFINTEA VI. I was part of the delegation from the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education in CONFINTEA VI, which happened in Belém. And one of the activities that I did as part of the ice breaking is this song. We sang it at the start of what we called FISC, which was the Civil Society Forum. But in the middle of the conference, the sixth conference, there was so much debate around, adult education, the right to education, and we were staying. The conference center was very far from where civil society was staying. So we would, after a full day's work, we would have a 30-minute bus ride through the traffic in Belém to go and back to our accommodation. And it was something that one of the participants said, Robbie, why don't we sing that song to keep us alive, awake, enthusiastic in the middle of the bus in the dark, okay, night after working for the whole day. And so I used this as a way for me to remember what happened in Belém in 2009 in Belém. And I wrote this article for the ICAE website, and I said that, if we start to look at what is happening now in terms of just at the end of CONFINTEA, I described how we as the International Council for Adult Education, throughout the preparation process, during the Civil Society Forum that preceded CONFINTEA and the actual CONFINTEA, we made sure that we were alive to the realities of the times. We were alert to the opportunities to advocate for adult learning and education. If you see the acronym ALE, it's not the drink ale, it's adult learning and education. As part of the right to education and the right to lifelong learning, we were awake to the debates on education and lifelong learning happening at that time. So we're not just about the realities, but the opportunities, but also the debates. And we were very enthusiastic to advance the commitments made in the Marrakesh Framework for Action, which is where CONFINTEA VII has happened in Morocco, or the MFA, as I will refer to say that to guide us in harnessing the transformational power of ALE within a lifelong learning perspective, for the purpose of achieving a socially cohesive, fulfilling, inclusive, and sustainable future for all. So using the song, I wanted to pick up not just the words of alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic, but hopefully the energy. And this is the same energy that in the framework that hopefully I'd like to be able to share with you today. And hopefully you will remain enthusiastic throughout this presentation. If at any point you have a question, please feel free. As I said, we're a small enough group, you can raise your hand to clarify any of the words perhaps that, or acronyms that I start using. So how do I want to do the presentation today? There'll be 4 parts to the presentation today. First, I'd like to situate my reflections on CONFINTEA VII, okay? My own CONFINTEA journey, and particularly the outputs of civil society. So I ground myself while I work at the university. I'm an academic, and I ground myself really in terms of the work that I have done in civil society. Second, I will then focus on the outcomes of CONFINTEA, particularly because of the interest of CRADLE in terms of adult and lifelong learning, in adult education and lifelong learning, but again, from the perspective of civil society. I will then look at the post-CONFINTEA, like after CONFINTEA happened in June, there were key events, key global events that happened that are focused on education, particularly the Transforming Education Summit that happened in September, that was called by the UN Secretary General. So it happened at the same time as the General Assembly in September. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Johannesburg, where the World Assembly of the Global Campaign for Education, the GCE, which is the largest civil society organization campaigning and advocating for education, okay, not just adult education, for education in general, had its 7th World Assembly. And finally, I'd like to conclude by looking not at solutions, but looking at the tensions, okay? Looking at the tensions around adult learning and education and then lifelong learning as it relates to what we saw after CONFINTEA. And so I'd like to start by situating myself again in terms of CONFINTEA. Okay, my CONFINTEA journey is very much rooted in the civil society movement in AIL. I have been very, 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 very lucky when I think about it to have participated in 3 CONFINTEA. As it was mentioned by Muir, CONFINTEA only happens every 12 years. So you will now therefore know how long I have been in the civil society movement on adult learning and education if I was able to participate 24 years ago. Okay, and so I was at Hamburg as a young adult environmental educator from the Philippines, so excited. And if you can read, there's a theme there that focuses on environment, health, and population. That was the theme that I was assigned to work on. I am a scientist by training. I'm an environmental scientist by training who happened to find myself really interested in working in community education in the Philippines. I thought I was going to bring science to the people. So I was going to teach them science like I was teaching biology 101. What I had experienced by working and immersing myself with the people is a kind of adult learning and a kind of community education that actually contextualized my science. And so my science was actually deepened, okay, because of the engagement with people's realities. And when I talk of people's realities, I mean indigenous peoples, migrant women workers in the Philippines, okay, sugar workers, farmers, okay, are the people that we worked with in the attempt to try to be able to raise their awareness. So this is where my experience of adult education comes from. I have not been as lucky to study adult education. I've only done 1 education course throughout my whole studies, and it was an environmental education course in my master's. So for me, I learned adult education through practice. Through the doing and through meeting people like Mike, through meeting people like the colleagues in the International Council is how I have grown as an adult educator. So this is my journey. So as I said, from Hamburg to CONFINTEA, which is in Bilem, but also then we hosted in Korea the midterm review. So after each of the main conferences, 6 years after, there's meant to be a midterm review. There was a big midterm review in 2017 in Korea, in Suwon, and this is a photograph of the Asia delegation. Not all of us, but most of us were there. The Japanese colleagues, colleagues from the Philippines, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And then in preparation for CONFINTEA VII. Now, CONFINTEA VII, people will mostly see CONFINTEA VII in terms of the date in June when it happened. But before CONFINTEA VII, the first meeting actually happened in July 2020. Okay, so in July 2020, there was a series of regional consultations that was hosted by the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, the International Council for Adult Education, and the German Adult Education Association. This was to start the process of CONFINTEA, particularly to talk about what was... I'm hearing an echo now. Particularly to talk about what we call GRAIL, the Global Report on Adult Learning and Education. And so from July 2020 all the way up to June 2022, there were a series of regional consultations hosted by UIL, DVV, and ICAE. There were regional meetings that were happening also that was hosted by both the civil society, but also by government. All of this, of course, were online because of and this was like, we were just in the midst of the pandemic, okay? So it was possible to bring people together online, okay? And this peaked in April 2022 when we had the public online consultation for the Marrakesh Framework for Action. And the Marrakesh Framework for Action basically is an outcome of each CONFINTEA comes up with a framework for action. Okay, so it's important to see from a perspective of civil society that we have been engaged in the CONFINTEA process even before CONFINTEA VII was started, but also in the intense, so for 2 years, from July 2020 all the way to June 2022 when we convened in Marrakesh. When we convened in Marrakesh, we started with the Civil Society Forum. Okay, so this is at the Civil Society Forum before the main event happened in the conference center in the hotel where it was happening. You might be wondering why I am not in the photo at the right, on your right. I think it's because after this Civil Society Forum, I unfortunately contracted COVID. So I was in Marrakesh. I couldn't attend the conference. I was monitoring the conference from the hotel room, unfortunately. But again, because there was an opportunity to participate. Basically, I was pleased in the sense that I was able to participate in the Civil Society Forum. Which we organized, and as my role in the president of ICAE. But I think the opportunity for the president to disappear allowed the members of the executive who are from all over the world to be able to take on the role. And so the vice president, so this you see is Katerina Popovich speaking on behalf of civil society, but also the vice presidents took a bigger role in terms of carrying the message of ICAE at CONFINTEA. So I just wanted to say it's been a long process. Now, what has happened after, therefore, there are two outputs to CONFINTEA. The first output for us as civil society is the declaration of the Civil Society Forum. This was the declaration that civil society wanted to bring to CONFINTEA. Again, the declaration was agreed on during the Civil Society Forum. It was a one-day event, but this declaration was something that we were preparing as part of the two-year process as well. So we have been traveling with this declaration. By the time we got to the Civil Society Forum, the declaration was a result of the consultations and discussions from around the different regions. And of course, the Marrakesh Framework for Action. The Marrakesh Framework for Action is the agreement. Now, I need to emphasize that CONFINTEA is a Category 2 conference for UNESCO. Now, a Category 2 conference for UNESCO means it's an intergovernmental conference. And therefore, officially, only governments are allowed to be in the forum, allowed to vote for approvals of the Marrakesh Framework for Action or whatever actions. Civil society is recognized as an important partner, the same with the private sector, for example, but we are only observers. Okay, we are only observers in this process. Okay, now as much as there is a recognition that civil society is a key player in adult learning and education, because a lot of adult learning and education is really non-formal community-based, and therefore it's delivered by civil society, NGOs, okay, small community groups. Okay, we are still, I wouldn't say at the mercy, we are still therefore only able to advocate through our governments, okay, or through opportunities that we are given to speak. And so while the outputs here are the main outputs that have come out from the forum, it's important for us as civil society, I talk about outcomes. I talk about outcomes where primarily CONFINTEA VII was able to help us build the movement of adult learning and education. In a way, what happened before COVID would be you had meetings, so people had to travel. Okay, we could not afford all of that. So because of the technology that became available, it was easier to develop and build the capacity of the movement across the world. Okay, the main challenge, of course, was still language, but we were able to overcome some of those language barriers through interpreting, translation that was happening in the process of the 2 years. But more than that, okay, as I said, if governments are the only people who can speak at the forum officially and vote, this was a strategy that we built on. And this relied specifically on our civil society organizations in each of the countries, okay, in each of the countries to be able to, okay, vote in favor of some of the provisions that we wanted to see, okay. And so what happened here was basically we managed to get, it wasn't as easy to get the Marrakesh framework for action, but what happened here was we relied primarily, and there was a lot of work done by our European colleagues, the European Adult Education Association, okay? There was a lot of work done by our Asian colleagues, the same with our African colleagues, okay? And so it was interesting to be able to see that some of the provisions we thought would not pass were actually supported by some of the governments. And once the governments supported them, they were therefore, there's some issues that were still contentious, particularly around financing, but most of what we had in the declaration managed to get into the framework. Of course, the words were different. So for me as civil society, this needs to be told as part of the story. The story of CONFINTEA is not just about the output documents. The story of CONFINTEA is as much about the movement building that happened, okay, during and prior to CONFINTEA. So let's focus now on the particular outcomes. I've talked about civil society as the outcome, but now in terms of the output of CONFINTEA, for example, first, the Civil Society Forum had the declaration. The declaration helped us to be able to be very clear about education as a human right, adult education as a core component of lifelong learning. Because of the interest of Cradle on lifelong learning, you will see that I'm highlighting some of the yellow text in lifelong learning, that adult learning and education is beneficial, not just for the personal life, but life-wide and life-deep for communities and society, that adult learning and education is holistic and intersectorial, in some terms intersectoral or across disciplines. Diversity is at the heart of ALE, okay, and because ALE manifests itself differently, like in a lot of Latin American countries, it's called Educación Popular, which is popular education of the Paulo Freire, but also that the other thing that's important about this CONFINTEA is because the previous CONFINTEA in 2009 was before the SDGs happened, okay? And so the Belém framework for action had nothing about the SDGs. And now, as you would know, everything in development, and even in education, is about the SDGs. So the SDGs had to become central in this particular CONFINTEA because it wasn't there in the Belém framework for action. But it's the recognition that adult learning and education is an essential component of SDG 4, and we cannot achieve any of the SDGs without education, particularly without adult learning and education. And so therefore, as a declaration, there are 2 slides here we commit to. We commit to transformative adult learning and education, recognizing that transformative ALE requires literacy for all as the basic foundation. More and more now, they speak to what they call foundational knowledge, okay? But that when we talk of lifelong learning, you cannot talk of lifelong learning for all without talking about adult learning and education. Central to adult learning and education is inclusion and participation. This can only happen if we get financing, and therefore financing of education is central. But also there's a recognition that as much as there is professionalization of teachers, it's important that we also have professionalization of adult learning and education. Okay, educators need to have professional status as well. The other commitments that we made through the declaration are, 1, about gender equality, a recognition, and more now, because of it, and you might have this also there, like here we have what they call the job skills gap here in Australia, and so more and more now what they see adult learning and education is narrowly just VET. But we're saying, yes, VET or vocational education and training is important, an important component, but we're not just asking for skills training, we're also asking it should enable people to be employed in decent jobs. Okay, so it's the relationship between the kind of skills and the kind of jobs that they're able to secure. Okay, technology is a driver of progress in education, but the problems we're facing are not technological. There are certain problems that cannot just be solved by technology. In fact, sometimes we talk about problems that are caused by technology, and that as civil society, this is central to the ICAE, civil society plays the foundational role in adult learning and education as a partner, working with government agencies and other actors. So this is the declaration. This is the declaration that we took. This is the declaration that ICAE took to each of the governments and told them this is what we want in the Marrakesh Framework for Action. And some of the governments adopted some of this discussion. And again, this did not only happen in the day before. This kind of advocacy with the governments was happening even before CONFINTEA. So what is in the Marrakesh Framework for Action? So allow me to just give you an overview of the Marrakesh Framework for Action. The title of the framework is Harnessing the Transformational Power of ALE. Okay, so the language of ALE, again, thanks to the German Adult Education Association, or DVV, they convened an international civil society series of workshops to come up with and say, how do we there, because sometimes it's referred to as adult and community education, it's referred to as adult education, youth and adult learning. And so what we've agreed to is and this was agreed together also with the global campaign, the UIL, is to refer to it as adult learning and education, recognizing the diversity that will happen in each of the regions. So the structure of the MFA, you have the preamble, you have principles and priority areas, okay? And then you have the action recommendations for transformative ALE, okay? Which has a series of subsections, and then you have international cooperation for enactment and monitoring. So that's the action point, okay? What I'll do is I will not go and present it as if it was the whole document. What I will do is I will pick up key themes, okay? I will pick up key themes that for me are important from the perspective of civil society around the Marrakesh Framework for Action, and invite you to go through the document yourself in your own time to see how it is structured. So I'm going to take a more thematic approach. I just want to mention, you have the photographs on the side, and these are photographs of our civil society colleagues. Particularly, this is the colleague from Sweden who was a member of the official delegation, but she was actually also on the board of the International Council, and she was the official rapporteur for the conference. Okay, so she is reporting at the end of the conference, and it was really so. As I said, I was watching online, but it really felt so good that our voice as civil society, but again, in agreement with the other governments, our reflections and our insights as civil society were shared at the closing of CONFINTEA. Okay, so first, one of the key things that if you read the Marrakesh Framework for Action, is the centrality of the SDGs to ALE and lifelong learning. And this is Timothy Ireland from Brazil, who's a vice president for Latin America. Okay, the preamble specifically, as I said, it had to specifically talk about the SDGs because the SDGs were not mentioned in the Belém Framework for Action, but it specifically says that we reflect on major global efforts in promoting ALE and lifelong learning since 2009. Okay, and there's a greater recognition by the international community of the need to promote lifelong learning as part of SDG 4 that states to ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Okay, now in terms of the key documents, if for those of you who are interested, the key documents that were really the basis of the Marrakesh Framework for Action were, of course, the 2030 Agenda, the SDGs. Education 2030 was the document that was produced at the end of this conference in Korea in 2015. Again, this was before the SDGs were formulated. This became SDG 4. There's a UNESCO recommendation on adult learning and education in 2015, and some of you should be familiar with the International Commission on the Futures of Education that was also convened in 2021 to be able to, as the next step, if you're familiar with the Faure report in 72, I think, and the Delors report in 1996, this was the next reimagining of the future by UNESCO in terms of called the futures of education. And this is something really worth looking at if you're really interested in how not just UNESCO, but how the governments, the civil society also see the education for of the future. And then, of course, the conceptual definitions for ALE, okay, as found in the recommendation on adult learning, but also lifelong learning is defined in Education 2030. We affirm that ALE is a key component of lifelong learning, and lifelong learning is the major engine for a learning society. And the concept of the learning society comes back into the Delors, and I think it's far back as Faure. So when you start to think of how it is positioned and how it is defined, these are the key documents. And central to this document is, I would argue, that you cannot have lifelong learning without adult learning in education. That is central to the argument that we would like to make. Now, what are we trying to answer? If we talk about transformative ALE, as I said, we're alert or alert to the issues that are happening. The contextual realities that shape the MFA during that time, of course, we start with, of course, the pandemic. Okay, while the pandemic was top of mind, what we're trying to say that yes, COVID-19 is the top of mind. Central to ALE is actually the idea of learning for individual well-being and the need for public health. It's not just about COVID-19. COVID-19 exposed the problems around equity in health, around equity in vaccines, okay, that has been there for a long time. And so part of the Marrakesh Framework for Action is to acknowledge COVID-19, but more importantly, to acknowledge the vision of the kind of health and equity that we want. Second, there was a growing issue around violent extremism and lack of peace and security. And therefore, part of, again, linking to SDG 4 is the idea that ALE can contribute to the culture of peace, understanding, and active global citizenship, which is SDG 4.7 that talks about active global citizenship, education for sustainability. And of course, climate change. How can you have a framework for action that does not address climate change as one of the biggest threats? Okay, and therefore climate education must be mainstreamed in lifelong learning systems. Okay, we were actually arguing for what, not just climate change education or climate education, we wanted climate justice. But the concept of justice and climate was not as acceptable to the governments at that time. But if you have followed COP27, in COP27, the loss and damage fund that was established was on the basis, therefore, of recognizing that climate change is about justice as well. So I think had the MFA happened now, the words might have changed. And this is significant. This is significant because climate change education or climate crisis education and climate justice education are very different. Okay, and so when we start to say, oh, they're just words, but they're not. They're principles that underpin the kind of education and the perspective we have around the issues that we talk about. Aside from contextual realities that the MFA acknowledged, there were education realities that were being responded to. Okay, one is, again, 770 million adults still lack basic literacy skills. And so while we need to be able, people are now moving to digital literacy, we cannot go digital literacy unless we start to really address basic literacy skills or the foundational skills that are still absent in some of the countries around the world, particularly here in the Asia Pacific around the subcontinent around India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and I think also, of course, where Stephen and Priscilla are in parts of Africa. So we need to still see literacy as a continuum. It's not you get literacy and it's finished. No, literacy is a continuum that we need to be able to recognize, but that what used to be a linear education to work transition is no longer the case. Okay, you study, then you work. Now you study, you work, and study at the same time. We need to provide more flexible ways, more equitable ways for acquiring relevant knowledge, and the need to be able also to recognize, okay, that some people get skills not necessarily because they studied, but because they have been working throughout their life. How do we recognize this kind of competencies that people gain throughout their life course? So I started with definition. I went next to context of realities in education. And then there's a section, of course, on principles. And the principles map out a lot to the principles we talk about in our own declaration. That promoting ALE within a lifelong learning perspective is important. And the Marrakesh Framework for Action talks about developing a culture of lifelong learning. Reaffirm that education is a human right. Reaffirm that we need a more holistic approach. Holistic is not just life-wide, lifelong, life deep, but that we recognize formal, non-formal, and informal learning, okay, as important. And of course, now the whole idea of blended learning and online learning without diminishing and actually the value of face-to-face learning, okay. Recognizing diversity and inclusion are central to access and equity, and therefore commit to increasing participation in both non-formal and formal adult learning and education. And how do these principles translate into the actual action? So in terms of the three areas, provision, practice, and policy. In terms of ALE provision, okay, it's how ALE provision is the delivery of ALE. It is important to recognize and to build on institutional capacities that will promote lifelong learning. People need to realize that in terms of lifelong learning is not just delivered by community learning centers, by adult learning centers. It's also delivered by museums, by libraries, for example, by sports centers. You know, all these capacities for adult learning is happening in different settings. And so this diversity of learning spaces need to be recognized. Okay, we need to professionalize and specialize adult learning and education. The workplace continues to be an important site for learning. And that learning pathways, and I think I mentioned this earlier, there are flexible learning pathways and the recognition, validation, and accreditation of not just formal learning. It's not just a piece of paper that allows you to say, I've learned something, but how do we recognize, validate, and accredit non-formal and informal learning needs to be therefore recognized. So are the things in terms of ALE provision. In terms of ALE practice, quality ALE practice has to be gender responsive, okay, consistent with the principle of gender. We need to have a gender sensitive information system that is reliant, therefore, on understanding how ALE is delivered, who are benefiting from ALE, and so gender disaggregated data, for example, is important. And then we have the importance of conducting research and evaluation is central. Hence, the role that you play, particularly those in Cradle, the role that academics, researchers play, okay, like Stephen and Priscilla, but also the support we have. And this is what we're trying to say from civil society. It's not just academics and universities doing this, but how do we therefore also promote inclusion in this process of research? Research does not only happen by or in universities, research happens within communities. And how can we, therefore, as researchers, play this role to support adult learning and education? And finally, yes, we can provide adult learning and education. Yes, we can have good practice, but unless we have policy that supports and sustains this, then we're not going to be able to sustain this in the long run. And so the policy advocacy continues to be that we have ALE as part of our human rights framework for lifelong learning. Adult literacy should receive policy attention and financial support, so financing should be part of the policy framework. Increase public funding. We have a lot of debates around public funding for schools. How do we have public funding for ALE? I know it's not possible to fund everything, but therefore, how do we resource it if it's not funding? How can government work with, for example, the private sector around workplace learning? How can governments, for example, work with the private sector in terms of community learning? okay? And call on existing global funds like the Global Partnership for Education, which is the biggest partnership for funding. But the Global Partnership for Education has declared that they're only funding youth and adults, children and youth, sorry, not adults, okay? And so this is what we're trying to say. The Global Partnership for Education has decided that this is what we need to fund as a priority. We are saying that it's not necessary that you fund everything, but if the Global Partnership can at least, because this is what we committed to in the SDG 4, lifelong learning opportunities for all. And yet the commitment to the funding is only for children and at best youth. So with that, therefore, what has happened? Okay, what has happened after CONFINTEA? So I've taken you through the document, but as I said, thematically, the definition in terms of where it comes from, the principles, the practice of it, and the advocacy of it will follow in terms of what are the actions, therefore, from MFA to advocate for CONFINTEA. What are we advocating for? One, of course, we need to advocate that to take this framework for action forward through relevant mechanisms. There's no point in having a nice document when you don't have somebody advocating for it and it does not find itself in policy. To commit to ongoing exchange of knowledge and practice, okay, opportunities for such exchange should happen across governments and within national governments, for example, okay. A commitment to further support international cooperation initiative aimed at improving ALE and promoting lifelong learning, and of course, a monitoring and evaluation system. So these are parts of the things that the MFA advocated for. In addition, there's a commitment to paying specific attention to the following categories of member states: conflict areas, small island developing states like in the Pacific, or our colleagues in the Pacific say the big ocean states rather than small island states, African states, and least developed countries. This is where, as we said, literacy is still a problem, okay? Interestingly, because of where we were in Marrakesh, there was a commitment for to set up an African Institute for Lifelong Learning. Will be established, and hopefully our colleagues in Africa can follow this up. Okay, there's been a commitment to that, an initiative of the Kingdom of Morocco. And of course, to call on UNESCO and UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning as the main tool, the main institution responsible for monitoring and hosting the midterm review in 2028. So what has happened to this advocacy and to these actions? Okay. The first thing that at the end of the CONFINTEA, this was the press release of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. It says over 140 countries call for right to lifelong learning to transform education at UNESCO conference. I hope you can see why the difference. It was meant to be an adult learning and education conference, and yet the headline is it's to promote the right to lifelong learning. Okay, so this is one of the tensions I will speak to later. But basically, when you look at the Marrakesh Framework for Action, it talks about significantly increased participation in adult learning and education. So it keeps coming up, which it should, but there's this tension now between what do we promote, lifelong learning or adult learning and education. And we say there should be no conflict between any of that. This process should explore the appropriate ways to translate the vision of a right to lifelong learning with adult learning and education at its core. Is again in the Marrakesh Framework for Action. So this is what we as ICAE stand on, that you cannot promote lifelong learning without adult learning as at the core. So where do we hope to see the MFA advocated for? At the end of CONFINTEA, okay, the colleagues from UNESCO said we will use the Transforming Education Summit. So CONFINTEA ended in June, the Transforming Education Summit in September. The Transforming Education Summit had 5 tracks, action tracks. Action track 1, inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy schools. Action track 3, teachers, teaching, and teaching profession. Action Track 4, Digital Learning and Transformation. Action Track 5, Financing of Education. And Action Track 2, which is, I make it bigger because this is where we were able to secure a place. Learning and Skills for Life, Work, and Sustainable Development was where we found ourselves to be able to advocate. In this particular track alone was where our colleagues from the GCE and ASBE who were part of the committee, ICAE was not part of the working group, were able to insert the CONFINTEA process, at least insert to be able to talk about this. But again, the proof is in the outcome. The outcome, the Transforming Education Summit Vision Statement of the UN Secretary General. Again, I invite you to read this. The vision statement, while the problems of adult learning are identified in the context setting of the vision statement, no specific action items explicitly addressed to adult learning. However, lifelong learning does have a strong presence. In page 2, it talks about ensuring the right to quality education throughout life. And in page 3 of the statement, it calls for education systems to embrace the concept of lifelong learning. So for the major conference that has just happened before, not to mention adult learning and education, was for us really a disappointment. Now, it's not just adult learning that was not mentioned. Some of you might have been, before CONFINTEA, I think it was in May, the Higher Education Conference also happened. It's hosted by UNESCO, and it only happens every 10 years, the Higher Education Conference. Higher education was also missed in the Transforming Education Summit. We were lucky enough at the Global Campaign for Education to have Leonardo Garnier, who's the special advisor to the UN Secretary General for TESS. So he was the keynote speaker at the Global Campaign for Education World Assembly. So we asked him to address what are the key issues that TESS is interested in. Of course, the challenges we face is the crisis of equity, quality, and relevance. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. The education we need is an education for life, which again is lifelong learning. But if you're familiar with the Delors report, the 4 pillars, they have reframed it that there are 4 pillars now: learning to learn, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. Learning to know has disappeared. It's become learning to learn. So he opened with that. But the disappointment again comes when he comes that the main part of his talk was about transforming schools, teachers, and teaching resources. Transform schools into safe and healthy, inclusive learning places. Support teachers to transform as agents of change. The digital revolution, okay, if harnessed properly, could be one of the most powerful tools, okay, for transforming to quality education. And then, of course, he talks about investing, financing education, and he talked about education and poverty traps. So what I'm trying to say is that there seems to be a gap between what we spoke to in CONFINTEA, what UNESCO was going to be able to advocate for. When we spoke to him after his keynote, he said there was no intention not to put it in. He said there was just so many things happening. So many things happening at that point, and therefore, but hopefully the Transforming Education Summit has its initiatives that will happen after that we can continue to advocate for this. But I think you can see how, again, I'm not saying it was purposely missed, but again, the tendency again, when we talk of education, we think of schools. Even when we talk of lifelong learning, we think of children's education. So how do we therefore, it poses it gives us really the challenge as a civil society and adult learning and education to be able to focus the attention of people around adult learning and education as core to lifelong learning. I'd like to end with a positive story because, as I said 2 weeks ago, I was at the Global Campaign for Education. As I said, it's the biggest civil society network for education as a whole. Okay, lucky enough to be there, and we have been, advocating for adult learning and education is not just to UNESCO or to the governments. Advocating for adult learning and education also happens within civil society, and it's only in this global campaign where one of the issues or the foundational asks in the campaign priorities for the next 4 to 7 years is lifelong learning, and specifically adult learning and education. So we need to also advocate within our own ranks as civil society, because otherwise, even civil society, a lot of the big NGOs would be focused on girls, children, okay, education, and now youth education. And again, this is not or. We need to be able to maintain our commitment to lifelong learning that has ALE as central. So I'd like to finish up by just posing some tensions and open for discussion. So what are the tensions that we see and the challenges that we need to engage with? As I said, the first challenge really is around we identified the need to translate the vision of a right to lifelong learning into action, but we argue that we cannot translate lifelong learning without including adult learning at its core, and to ensure that it doesn't diminish the right to education, which already is in the Declaration of Human Rights. The second tension that we're facing is this whole notion that there is a recognition of multi-sectoral platforms are important for adult learning and lifelong learning, okay, with key actors, but often adult learning and education is relegated to the private sector, relegated to the workplace. I think governments are the duty bearers. Hence, we need to strengthen the role of governments. Now, the government might not finance it, but the government can still create policies, mechanisms, and regulation to ensure that adult learning and education happens throughout life and the opportunities are available for adults. And finally, the digital revolution. Okay, technology can be a driver of progress, but also technology, as we know, can create new barriers that make social collective learning more challenging, widening the social divides and creating new divides. Okay, we've seen that in the online learning that's happened during the lockdowns. And so we're not saying let's not do digital learning, but what's happening with digital learning that's being embraced a lot now is it comes with the private sector's interest. And so we need to distinguish between digital learning and privatization of education. And so with that, again, I'd like to conclude and say what I've argued for is, as civil society, we need to stay alive to the challenges we face if we are to achieve a more sustainable and equitable future. It's not just COVID that's the problem. Climate justice is a problem. We have peace as an ongoing problem that we have now. We have now a whole lack of, for example, energy resources are important. We need to continue to be alert to the role that education and lifelong learning plays to address these challenges. We need to be awake to the reality that we cannot have business as usual education. We need education and lifelong learning to be transformed if education and lifelong learning is to be transformative of our world. And yet we need to be aware that the tensions exist within our own education community. And finally, I look forward to a very enthusiastic audience today. We will not just reflect on CONFINTEA, but engage in what the MFA wanted to do to guide us in harnessing the transformational power of ALE within a lifelong learning perspective to achieve a more socially cohesive, fulfilling, inclusive, and sustainable future for all. Thank you very much. On behalf of the International Council and my colleagues in the International Council, and my colleagues, of course, from RMIT, the Global Campaign for Education, and thanks to CR&DALL and to Mike for the opportunity to be able to share these reflections with you. So I'm looking forward to an enthusiastic conversation. Thank you.